Hey everyone, this is Peter Zablocki, the host of the Daily History Shorts podcast. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. If this is your first time stopping by, I hope you stick around and return tomorrow for more fun history. And if you enjoy the Friday Conversation series, you can always find the entire backlog of conversations with historians, authors, Pulitzer Prize winners, and much more under the Conversations tab on our website at www.historyshortspodcast.com.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Today's conversation is proudly brought to you by The Collector, your destination for captivating stories that teach, inform, and inspire millions of readers every day. From ancient history to today's defining moments, from philosophy and art to exclusive interviews. Discover more at thecollector.com. My guest today is an esteemed British historian renowned for his deep expertise in Central European and Hungarian history, including extensive and illuminating research on the Habsburg Empire, spanning from the late 13th century to 1918, one of Europe's most enduring and influential dynasties of all time. Dr. Martyn Rady, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
My pleasure.
So let us get started on your own career. What initially sparked your interest in history, and how, why, and when did this turn into a career?
Well, if I tell you that my parents were both history teachers, that I actually went to the school that they taught at, I think you'll realise that it was pretty much preconditioned. I remember at the age of 8 or 9 keeping sort of sciencey magazines, and when my mother said, isn't it time to throw these out? I said I might need these later on for teaching. They were all about things like how a colour television might work. So, in a sense, I knew, much as I'd have liked to have been an international banker, no, that was never going to happen. So I found myself enjoying history, doing history, writing about history. I won a book prize at school for writing a history book called pretentiously The Rise and Fall of the Aztec Empire. I went on to university, read history, didn't want to say farewell to it, did a PhD, wanted to do something a little bit different. This was at a time when the history of France was thought exotic, so surprised everybody by doing Hungary and have stuck with Central Europe more or less ever since.
Are you ever drawn to any other topics in history besides the Habsburg and Central Europe?
Oh yes, I have that more and more now, and think, how how foolish I was to sort of lock myself into a small corner of Europe when there's a whole world out there. And I'm very envious of people who do things like, the Dutch overseas empire, and are always um, going to Indonesia or to South Africa or that sort of thing on conferences. I did have a colleague who did the history of the Canary Islands, and I thought that was a good one to do. But that was, in a sense, almost more outre than doing the history of Hungary. So, yeah, I've looked and thought of other things that would be worth looking at, particularly in the sphere now of African history, which is becoming uh, it's becoming much more professionalized. A lot of new sources are coming up. A lot of new questions and dating is taking place. So that might be something that I would look at given my time again. But that time is past.
What is one aspect of the Habsburg legacy, positive or negative, that you think is underappreciated or misunderstood today, and why?
I think there are two things. The first is the sheer scope of their empire. When I wrote that book, the Habsburgs um, to rule the world. The British title was Rise and Fall of a World Empire. I wanted to stress in particular just how far they got. That the Philippines are known as the Philippines after Philip II, the Habsburg King of Spain, who was the son of the Emperor Charles V. And it used to be that the front of Manila Cathedral had the twin columns representing the, if you like, the Habsburg dynastic motif, the Pillars of Hercules, and until the cathedral was rebuilt. They're not just in the Philippines; they're also Japan, obviously all of the New World, reaching over to Taiwan. They have Habsburgs have a settlement on Taiwan. In the 20th century, they have a settlement in China as well. So we are talking about an empire with tentacles that are much larger than just Europe, much longer than just Europe. And at the same time, we have an ambition to discover the world, which results in quite a large number of expeditions abroad in order to gather flora and fauna, to map out new areas and new dimensions. It's a Habsburg exploration vessel that first comes across Franz Josef Land, which is now the northernmost part of Russia. Foolishly, they didn't stick a flag on it, because if they had, then Austria might now be a gas exporter. But, we can get an idea of just how far these people went. That's the first point. The second point is not to understand their empire correctly. Everybody imagines empires are colonial, that they are ruled by colonial administrators who extract and extort money from the indigenous people. The Habsburgs aren't like that. They have a dynastic view of empire, that the countries that belong to them, that fall under their sway, should be allowed to continue governing themselves. They should keep their own nobilities, they should keep their own parliaments, they should keep their own tax systems, they should keep their own laws. And as a consequence, considerable rights of self-government attach to their possessions, to the extent that this is one of the problems that the empire confronts in the 18th and 19th centuries. In the 18th century, it would like to centralize more in order to do warfare. In the 19th century, it would like to centralize more because it thinks that's what modern states do. They find themselves, these entrenched rights belonging to the provinces, virtually unbreakable all the way up to the fall in 1918.
You ended with a really good point on this one. It makes one wonder, how does an empire so powerful as the Habsburg actually come to fall apart, in a sense?
Well, I think it's very straightforward. I think the first thing to notice is that lots of empires do fall at the end of the First World War. The First World War is something that rips the heart out of Europe, and to an extent America, in terms of manpower losses, the costs involved, the sheer awfulness of the conflict, and it promotes revolution. I mean, the first national revolution to break out in the First World War is Ireland. So the British Empire isn't immune to it. The Habsburgs are overthrown, the Russians are overthrown, the Ottomans are in a period of, to chase out the chronology would be quite difficult, but between roughly somewhere between 1908 and 1923-25, the Ottoman Empire collapses, and the final stage is the First World War. So it's not surprising that the Russian Empire goes down, the Habsburg Empire goes down. What makes it complete is that it hasn't managed to win over the national elites. It hasn't managed to reconcile statehood with nationhood. In fact, it would be virtually impossible for it to do that. I mean, modern historians nowadays very fashionably question the role of nationhood and nationality in the destruction of the Habsburg Empire, and point to the various centripetal forces at work, notions of um, citizenship, of dynastic loyalty. But ultimately, when we even look at the civic rituals that are enacted, they're enacted on an individual, a national basis. So, in processions, groups muster under national flags. When it comes to elections, which are great festive events, they actually, in many cases, put their ballot on national lists. So, in other words, their identity in the polling booth is not a one of common citizenship, but of separate nationality. So I'm a bit sceptical about the new history, which says that the Habsburgs aren't affected, that nationality isn't so important. I think it's vital, and I think that's what makes the destruction of the Habsburgs so absolute.
I see an article somewhere in here that I think you need to write.
I'm, I'm retired now. I'm done with writing articles.
Let's shift gears a little bit to Central Europe as a whole. You highlight moments like the Mongol invasions, the Reformation, and the post 1945 era as transformative for Central Europe. Which event or period do you see as the most defining for the region's identity and why?
I mean, I think in terms of the region's identity, I think it's going to sound a little bit obscure, but I think the double rise of Roman law, uh, plus the demands put upon government by warfare and by religion in the 16th and 17th centuries, these have a transforming effect across Europe. Up until this point, all of the parts of Central Europe, when whether one wants to look right over in the west to places like Frisia, if we can consider that Central Europe, right over to places like Transylvania, all of them have an idea of noble power, of very powerful parliaments, of very powerful nobilities, of laws that are entrenched in custom, and are resistant of the power of monarchs. Monarchs in Central Europe on the whole are pretty weak up until the 15th century. And then in the 16th century, Roman law comes in, and that teaches a whole abundance of principles. Uh, Most obviously, what pleases the prince has the force of the law, and most particularly, it has room for decree. In other words, rulers can legislate not by having to get a parliament together and haggle over taxes and legislation. They can simply issue decrees. And on top of that, the demands for money that rulers have to make them look for other sources of revenue that bypass parliaments, or they close down parliaments. And on top of this, they have, as a result of the religious war, they have a supreme moral authority. In the past, monarchs have not thought over much about their moral duties. From about 1550 onwards, rulers start to clamp down not so much on religious difference as one might presume, but instead on um, idleness, drinking, fornication, vagrancy. These become the new targets of rulers, and with that, the liberties that people have enjoyed in Central Europe become gradually eroded. So, that I think would be the most important process. Looking at single events, I would say 1526 is crucial because the Habsburgs change from being a an Austrian German dynasty to a dynasty which encompasses Bohemia and Hungary. And we have to bear in mind that Hungary is one of the largest states in Europe in the 16th century. And the Habsburgs are brought, if you like, into they're brought eastwards, so that it's not just the western part of Central Europe that is their domain, the eastern part of it is as well, and they have bring with it an obligation to fight the Turks and to defend Europe in fighting the Turks. The other turning point is, paradoxically, before the Habsburgs even get on the scene. We know of the earliest Habsburgs as around 900 AD, when they're lords of a rather unpleasant Swiss town, as it is now, called Brugg. Typically Swiss. The Swiss can think of nothing better to do with a historic town than smash out its centre and put in a railway line and station. That's what they've done at Brugg. But the old Habsburg Palace is still there, functioning as a youth hostel. And at this time, the point is they're very insignificant. But something significant has happened, and it has happened on 800 AD, and that is the coronation of Charlemagne, which does two things. Firstly, it creates the notion of empire in the West, which had disappeared at the end of the 5th century. It's now revived, and this will become one of the motifs, an organizing principle, a political principle that will endure until Napoleon. That's why there's only ever one emperor, one empire in Western Europe, and that's the Roman Empire, as the Holy Roman Empire always calls itself, the continuer of the old Roman Empire of antiquity. And I think that's important. It gives an imperial dimension that spills over and affects the way rulers in Central Europe will see themselves. And secondly, it's a counterpoint to Byzantium. At this point, Byzantium in the 7th, 8th, right on through to the 9th century, is beginning to, if you like, roll up large chunks of Central Europe confessionally. In other words, bringing them into the Orthodox fold. And behind that, it has the prestige of the Byzantine Empire. That prestige is inherited and taken by Charlemagne, inherited by his heirs and the German Saxon rulers, and is a counterpoise to Byzantine efforts. Without Charlemagne, one could imagine a whole swathe of Central Europe having become Orthodox in the same manner as the Balkans.
So, my last question for today: what was the impetus for your latest book, The Middle Kingdoms, A New History of Central Europe? And what surprised you the most while doing that research?
The impetus was COVID, which meant that I had to sit to do something during that outbreak. And what heartened me incredibly is I'm not particularly competent technologically, but I soon worked out ways whereby virtually the entire contents of the major libraries, I could get them on my laptop. Once you've discovered various little ruses and little tricks, you can work out how to do all these things. So that provided me with the capacity. It was simply having written a book on the Habsburgs, the next one logically was Central Europe. I'd covered part of the ground. I wanted to look at various things in more detail. And one of the things that surprised me and links in to what I was saying earlier were these volume upon volume of what I've called ordinal, patents, trees, decreta, all of these instructions written by rulers, particularly in the 18th century when it becomes a crescendo of law, all of which are issued in the form of decrees, all of which affect how people can live, what hours they should be on and off the streets, what type of pipes they should smoke, what type of hats are permissible, whether cripples are allowed in marketplaces in case they frighten women. there's just an endless stream of laws and decrees. The one I always like is the 5 legal methods of measuring the length of a fish. Um, this is the type of minutiae that governments are in, and they are interfering more and more with people's lives. I mean, we're talking about, I think one figure is something like in a 30-year span, one ruler issues something in the region of 40,000 decrees. So one can get an idea of how much is being issued, how much is being legislated for. And of course, people can't get through, people can't keep up with all of these measures. So they then have to produce additional distillations, books of cross referencing, in order to allow people to find out what laws have been passed. And on top of that, they issue laws which they never publish because they're secret. So one can find oneself falling foul of a law which has not even been announced.
So, Martyn, what are you currently working on?
I'm looking at Empire. The title is basically Empires and Borderlands on Europe's Edge. I'm looking at the relationship of Russia, the Ottoman Empire, Habsburgs, Germany, on that sort of space that lies between, that is now filled with Belarus, Ukraine, the Balkans, and trying to tease out some of the major developments there and why they should have had such a very different history to the rest of Europe in terms of the Orthodox religion falling under the sway of empire so readily, and why their borders are so malleable. So, in a sense, it's a commentary on what was happening in Ukraine and what has happened in previous decades in places like Yugoslavia and Bosnia.
I don't know about you, but I'm definitely finding it easier to do research from home ever since COVID.
Absolutely. And I always tell people when they're talking about producing, a book, I say you've got to go and make sure that it's digitally available. You've got to find a platform to stick it on. It's very easy to publish books these days. I mean, it's very cheap. I was publishing quite a lot of works by other people when I was a university teacher. We had our own little publishing house, and you can produce, say, 200 books, paperback, 200 books for £1,000. I mean, it's very, very cheap. And people have leapt onto this, particularly in Eastern Europe. And I said, well, look, it's all right doing this, but firstly, you've got to make sure the hard copy goes to the libraries. More particularly, you've got to go and stick the stuff up on the internet. You can put it up for free on Academia Edu. You can get it out there, and people will then read it. Don't think that people will really go out of their way and hunt down distant libraries in order to read what you've put together. They'll just ignore it. And I also tell them to avoid a lot of these unscrupulous publishing houses, which will charge them to publish their book, and they won't have it digitally available. In which case, and the publisher will charge £100 for a copy. In which case, that book is dead.
Dr. Rady, where can my listeners go to learn more about your work?
Well, I've got stuff on Academia Edu, if they want to go and have a look at that, but that's mostly pretty turgid stuff. I'm afraid they're going to have to buy the books. But what I find now is that firstly, I haven't got room for books any longer. Secondly, I can't really read them with my glasses any longer. So everything I get is electronic, mostly electronic. If the book's really important, then I'll buy it in hard copy and electronically. But it's very cheap now, electronic downloads, except for a few rogues who want to charge £80 for an article or something.
Martyn, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
My pleasure. I'm always happy to talk about history.